global supporters of open culture have gathered in Seoul to celebrate openness and sharing at the Creative Commons Global Summit 2015. At this event, two giants of the internet engaged in a very special discussion. The first was Professor Yohai Benkler of Harvard Law School, renowned academic and proponent of the sharing economy since the early 2000s. He is the author of The Wealth of Networks, which has become a modern classic, still frequently cited by academics around the world 10 years since its publication. Joining Professor Yohai Benkler from the U.S. is Korea's own Dr. Chun Gil-nam. The career of Dr. Chun Gil-nam, honorary professor at KAIST, is synonymous with the history of Korean internet. He made Korea the world's second country to be connected to the internet in 1982. He is the father of the Korean internet, who built the foundation for Korea to become the most connected country in the world. Let's hear what the two intellectual giants have to share about the connected world we live in.
I picked two questions from the questions submitted on the online platform, and the two of the questions are good starters for the conversation. The first question is someone in South Africa likes to know that as a person following your scholarship, that you have said in many statements that the internet has brought good things and bad things for society in general. So this person wants to know whether your position or your opinion has changed, and how is the reality. If you could share how you see the things here in Korea, how it has improved, and how it has gone bad in society. And the second question is okay, you wrote your famous book, The Wealth of Networks, 10 years ago. From 10 years to now, what has changed, and what would you frame differently?
What's different? I think some of the things that were perhaps more speculative in terms of the stability and significance of the commons and commons-based production are really hard to question anymore. Core utilities continue over a decade and a half or two now to really be produced by free software. Wikipedia really is the central model. We're seeing the model develop across efforts at governments to become more responsive to citizens. We're seeing companies trying to build things that are more engaging with users. We've seen people use the net for social mobilization to move the politics. Only recently in the US, we had what would have been inconceivable with the victory on net neutrality, would have been inconceivable 8 months earlier. And so in this regard, the book remains strongly anchored in the realities of life. At the same time, a central assumption that, a certain observation that was true at the time and that I claimed was very central to the development of commons-based production, generally peer production in particular, was the fact that for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, we had seen the core pieces of capital widely distributed in the population. Computation, communications, storage, sensing were widely distributed in the population, at least in the population of the wealthier countries, and allowed people to do the things that always came naturally and socially to make things that were economically meaningful. People always sat around in a room and spoke to each other and talked about the news, but doing so online made it into a news service. People always helped each other with doing things together or tinkering together or fixing a car or doing whatever. Doing it online suddenly made it into a core infrastructure like a web server. What we've been seeing in the last 7 to 8 years is a reconcentration of the truly powerful infrastructure and a weakening or thinning of the capital that's in the hand of people. So I'm talking about the move to the handheld, which brings us infrastructure that is proprietary over the cellular networks. I'm talking about the move to cloud computing that puts most of the powerful storage and computation in the hands of a small number of companies. I'm talking about the development of the App Store as a layer of control, about the use of big data to turn the system that could have been either a system for control or a system for very generative distributed activity into a system that provides surveillance capabilities both to governments and to a small number of private players, and the ability to design the platform on the fly to manipulate people's behavior. So the level of risk today that the same set of technologies will replicate concentrated infrastructure, concentrated power, and the ability to use the same network capabilities to create surveillance and control instead of self-authorship and collaboration is the great risk that I see today.
Okay, let me comment on this one. This internet started about 40 years ago. In the last about 10 years, it's start moving to the smartphone-based system. And this one we have to watch out. Before we developed an internet culture, which is a very open. Then this Creative Commons is just one of them. And now this smartphone, this ecosystem is driven by the big business. And they don't care so much on this openness, open source, open data. No, they are more about business driven. So this transformation, how does it affect us as a whole? I have a very serious concern. Let's start from the Korea. Korea, some happen to be in the internet. We are the early starter. We started internet in 1982 before anybody else except in the USA. And which has an advantage, but also has a disadvantage. Like spam and all those cyber security problems happen to the Korea first and the USA. Then we had to solve it. And we just didn't have enough know-how to solve this problem. So we solved, since we had to solve it anyway, so we solved in a very ad hoc way. And that became a permanent. So today, Korean banking system, including a credit card, is very difficult to use. And it's not particularly safe. And then you say, why don't you just change it? No. Changing this kind of things takes up 5-10 years, if it's not 15-20 years, and in the fortune. Africa, if you are late comer, sometimes you can take advantage. Just watch out us. Learn from our mistake. Do not to do it. Just like a bicycle. In a bicycle race, the one in the front suffer because of wind. The one in the second and third, you can take advantage of behind the leader. So that way, eventually we share this problem together. But I just try to take advantage of where you are.
Well, something that you mentioned, let's imagine that we are an environmental movement. One of the obvious environmental movement enemies is Shell, for example. That's the symbolism of evil, polluting and doing bad to the commons, polluting the waters, cutting trees for the oil explorations and so on. Which actor, and that question is for the two of you, which actor will be the one harming the commons the most in this space? Do we have the capability to act on it? Or is it a giant too big to fight?
I think there's no single stable giant. I think what there is a variety of actors and a variety of threats. And the responsible thing for people like us who care about the open internet, who care about the commons, is to not think at too high a level of abstraction, to understand the problems in their real context, to identify who the allies are and who aren't. 15 years ago, Microsoft was the bad guy. It turned out, for example, that on Open Spectrum, Microsoft and Google were the good guys. Interestingly now, as you're looking after the incredibly important revelations of Snowden, which just last week the European Court of Justice directly relied on to anchor the prohibition on bulk surveillance in a core commitment to human dignity. Some of the revelations suggested that actually the major companies, Google, Facebook, were part of the bad story, made things available. On the other hand, you suddenly saw a shift to more encryption, and Apple came forward with more encryption. So there are certain things in which Apple is a problem in terms of the App Store and control, and there are other things in which Apple becomes an ally. I think it's a mistake to think in terms of a unitary bad actor. What we have are imperfect systems. The countries are imperfect, the companies are imperfect, we're imperfect. We constantly need to judge locally what's going on, who's an ally, who's an enemy, where the interests are, who we can form alliances with, and then argue about doing what's ethical. And each time do what's ethical, do what's strategic, and move on.
Yeah, let me compliment the ecosystem. This whole thing is an ecosystem. The issue is how can we develop a commons, global commons, in order to address those issues and resolve those issues. And if we can develop a very good global common, then we are in a good shape. If we can't, it's awful. We'll face the inconvenience truth, as Al Gore said. So just try to avoid those inconvenient truths in this cyberspace. In order to that one, global commons, healthy global commons is the way to handle. So the Creative Commons is doing a good job.
One of the most...
Just to follow up on connecting to this question of the commons, one of the things we learned from Lynn Ostrom and the Ostrom School of Commons, what they described as the institutional analysis and development framework. And it was an attitude to thinking about the world. It was an attitude that saw that different contexts were richly different from each other, and you only got the right answers by looking at all of these factors and seeing how the things are connected to each other. So this is back to the point about not thinking in terms of systematically bad actors, always analyzing the details of what makes the ecosystem work, and the thing that could look like the big bad wolf turns out to have a really important impact by controlling the population of these little furry things that are wonderful. You just have to understand what in particular context works and build in response to that.
And to this ecosystem, what would be like the greatest threat at the moment? Like if we as activists need to pick one global battle, is it even possible to pick one single global battle? Let's say against DRM or against like what will be like the battle that you will choose?
Cybersecurity. In many ways, this may be the biggest obstacle we have. First, me as a technical background, technically we made a mistake back in 40 years ago. And today we haven't solved this security problem, technically. Then next, this nature of this security is so easy to attack, so difficult to defend. Then this cyberspace also this sort of reflection of the real world. And we are getting so much those disturbance, malicious act in this area. And I don't know if we can solve it. We should be able to solve it. Otherwise, we'll have those bunch of those walled garden, gated community. If you go outside, it's very dangerous. You just stay inside. Then we may lose global commons too.
Security is an issue, but I'm not sure it's an issue in the same way that you're describing it. I think fear is an issue. I think it's very easy to manipulate concerns of security for purposes of legitimizing control. I think we've seen it certainly in the US over the last 15 or 14 years, concerns about national security being used well beyond what's necessary. We saw that with warrantless wiretapping, we saw that with excessive surveillance, and I won't talk about the graver issues of torture. Security is a real concern. When a city is deeply insecure, it collapses socially. We do have to solve security as a problem. But security is also abused easily, and we need to be very realistic about our concerns. We live with 1.3 million deaths from automobile accidents around the world. We're not canceling the car because of it. We live in great cities, even though they might be less secure than many rural communities. So we live with risk all the time. Being able to absorb and be resilient and respond without shutting down the system is really important. So while I recognize the importance of security threats as very real, I also recognize the fact that there are always extremely powerful forces trying to exaggerate the claims, exaggerate the risk, exaggerate the security that comes from locking things down. And our critical commitment needs to be to openness. So you asked what would be a single target. I think the single target is not something specific like DRM, not a specific battle like the TPP, but it's the continuous fight for openness throughout all layers of the network society, both in terms of the technology and in terms of the organizational and institutional structures. And then you just have to live and diagnose. What is tomorrow's 5 threats to openness? These are the ones that are our battle. But we need to define our target at that level, I think.
But see, one of the problems, back in say 20, 30 years ago, internet is much smaller. So it doesn't have so much of the business stake. But now it's a big business. And for the big business, if the openness is good for them to maximize their sale or profit, they will do it. Otherwise, they don't. And they have a power, muscle. So how do we counter? Again, back to those global commons. That's the only way we can really fight against those abuse.
We have to be able to build it ourselves, not only rely on law. The big business does have enormous institutional power and legal systems. The first generation of the net was very much built by and for people who were aiming for openness and created alternative through free and open source software to the infrastructure. That has to be a core target, identifying points of control and creating commons-based alternatives so that people can fall back on them and not be stuck within the controlled systems.
And so, power to the people now. Who is willing to ask the first question? We let our guests to answer.
The dichotomy, the shift that you described of sort of the socially responsible uses of the net versus the corporate-driven, exploitive, extractive uses, often rely on systems like these walled gardens where it makes it more convenient for people. You know, a lot of the reasons people fall into these traps is because it's been made very easy, and very often for those of us who want to avoid these kind of traps, it's more difficult. For the classic example, when Windows was the dominant paradigm, if people wanted to reject it and use Linux, they had to do a lot more work to be free. Do you think it will always require us to convince people to change their behavior and do more work to stay free and open and to preserve it? Or do we have to think about how we make it as convenient to be free as it is to be a prisoner?
Yes, I think it is absolutely true. Bruce Schneier was saying this, fear and convenience, the two great drivers of people into lockdown systems that don't actually give them freedom. I think it's incumbent on, and I actually think this is also a consequence not only of the technology but of the transition from the first 100 million or 200 million to the billion, which is to say more people who actually just want stuff. Netflix. It's just another TV screen. I do think it's incumbent on those of us who are building alternative platforms to make sure that they are easy. But as you say, well, it depends, right? So with Linux it didn't, but with Firefox it did. So, and that actually changed dramatically the market share. So I think that needs to be part of the package whenever an alternative platform is built, to understand that market share matters. That creates a real risk. We saw with Firefox needing to implement the DRM sandbox, that once you actually care about market share, even if you're a free and open source, publicly oriented project, it creates limitations for you. But I don't think we have a choice, because otherwise all we're building is a safe preserve for the few who actually are willing to work hard for their freedom, and the whole point is actually to make freedom easy for everyone.
And the last question, I'm sorry, I just can take one more to Carolina, please.
Women are being targeted in the digital world with violence, which are preventing them from speaking. Many women are having reactions to shut down their social networks and not to express themselves. But the reactions many times from a feminist point of view are oftentimes also a threat against freedom of expression. They tend to say we should shut down comments and there should be blocking and many other things. For me, this is a real future threat for an open internet for everybody. I wonder, what do you think about it?
Yes, this is an issue that we see online, but it is fundamentally an issue of open society more generally, not of open internet more specifically. That is to say, when you have tightly structured communities, it's very easy to control all sorts of offense and pain, but it's very hard to then actually create a decently participatory and open society. And once you open things up, you get all sorts of violence, and particularly in a society in which, a global society in which women still very much are not equal in the majority of places, you get violence. I think it's a basic tension that we see throughout open society. I can't tell you that I'm a free speech absolutist in the sense of no matter what, but I don't think that we can simply say shut things down. I think the core battle is a battle over values. It's a public battle over values rather than of shutting down systems. And it's not specific to the net, it's general to any open society. So the raising the issue, debating it, educating, just like physical violence against women is not something that just disappears. It disappears if you have major campaigns, if you have enforcement where enforcement is appropriate, and if you have primarily a change in consciousness, a change in the way people understand things. I think that's the direction we're going to need to go.
Okay, the good and bad news. Bad news, Korea is pretty bad on this cyber violence, including one famous actress committed suicide because she was sort of attacked in the cyberspace. So we have to, we are suffering, and we have to do something. And good news, do you know internet used to be male dominant, and now because of SNS, it's changing. Do you know now in a developed country more women use SNS than the male? That's the statistics we're just getting. So seems to be this one is SNS part of the internet suit to the woman better than the male. And another good news is one of my friends, Henrietta, She organized a gender and the internet last month at the workshop during the Africa Internet Governance Forum. And probably we are going to do something similar in Asia and all over. I guess we should address this one more formally, set up in a workshop all over the world. Then identify what are the issues so that we can take action. But I'm optimistic because of those SNS sort of become a dominant application where the female using more than the male.
Thank you very, very much for your collaboration. Especially it was very, very interesting to see two of the smartest scholars on internet issues debating the tricky issue of women violence online, and also debating the mobile platforms. I think that those are the two takeaways for our community to start thinking about and to start debating.